Hey, Derek, how's it going, man?
It's going good, going good. Looking forward to having this chat.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the UBSH study podcast. Today we're going to talk about Adam and Eve.
Sounds good. One of my favorite
Nice.
topics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you were telling me that the story of Adam and Eve kind of relates a little bit to your life's journey.
It does. It does. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why why I gravitate to Adam and Eve more than most of the other historical characters in the book. We shouldn't say characters, they're actual people, right? But I gravitate to their story because I think I have a lot of parallels in my own life and my own search and things like that. So I kind of feel like they're also among the most human of the celestial people in our planetary history as well. Because, we'll get into it, but they made a huge mistake and they spent the rest of their lives trying to make up for that mistake. They put enormous effort into it and made the best that they could from the mess that happened, and it was acceptable. So I think that's something that, because we all mess up and I just think that knowing that their efforts were acceptable and appreciated in the light of such a devastating default, I think that gives us a lot of hope. So I come at this from a very specific point of view. And that point of view is one of someone who was given up for adoption at birth. And I spent most of my adult life looking for my birth family and my biologic roots, and it took 35 years to find my birth parents and my birth families. And I kind of feel like there's a lot of parallels in our planetary, like my individual journey is parallel to a planetary journey, because in a lot of ways and literal ways, Adam and Eve are supposed to be our planetary parents. And for reasons that we'll get into, they defaulted and they're not here anymore. So we have this feeling of abandonment, I guess. And regardless of whether it actually was abandonment or not, that's what the child feels. And so we have this aimlessness and we're searching and we have this feeling of well, we're looking for our parents, is what I'm trying to say. And I was doing that on an individual level. And I think planetarily, we're kind of doing that as well. And so hearing the real story of Adam and Eve and really, really understanding what happened, and not only what happened, but where they are now and what they're doing to help us, because they're still very much involved in our planetary administration, just in a different capacity. It's a foundational thing, I think, for me as an individual, having gone through the experience of searching and searching and searching and just feeling in the back of my mind that there was always something missing. And then finally finding what that was, finding my birth family and finding my roots and finally understanding where I fit in. I think that reading the account of Adam and Eve in the Urantia book and finding out exactly what happened, and where we fit in as a planetary civilization. I think that is just as revolutionary as my own personal journey as finding my birth parents, right? It's almost exactly the same thing. So yeah, it's just Adam and Eve it's for me, like it's just this, it's a parallel search of understanding roots and origins, and as I said before, it's also got a lot to do with how absolutely human they actually kind of were and became, and they made mistakes, and they made a big one, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to make up for it, and they did an amazing job. So Adam and Eve are awesome as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Well, maybe we should briefly kind of discuss the Adam and Eve story as it's outlined in the Urantia book, just in case anybody's watching this who isn't really familiar with it. I mean, we don't have to spend a ton of time going over it, because most people who are watching this are probably very familiar with it, but maybe a brief summary.
Sure. Adam and Eve are part of a much larger planetary story, obviously. And I know in previous episodes you've talked about the planetary rebellion and everything. Adam and Eve are the next bestowal of divine guidance on a planet. And this isn't just our planet. Every evolutionary world has this series of the bestowal of sons of God to help guide civilization and grow civilization, right? So, firstly, everybody gets a planetary administration, and the head of that administration is referred to as a planetary prince, and we got that. They went into rebellion and betrayed our planet. And Adam and Eve, they're the next ones. And they have a couple of jobs. So the planetary prince is supposed to come and basically start civilization. They come down from heaven to bestow the gift of civilization upon mankind. And on normal worlds, this is a co-creative process between humanity and divinity, civilization, right? And so that all went to just totally bad because of the rebellion and because of the betrayal. Adam and Eve, when they come, they're supposed to build on what the planetary prince and his staff have already achieved over the course of up to 500,000 years, we're told. So you can imagine what kind of civilization could have been in place after 500,000 years. Adam and Eve come here to inaugurate a renaissance of science and culture and spirituality, and they also come to biologically upstep humanity by skillfully and strategically injecting their DNA into the human gene pool. And then as they're doing that, it's skillfully and strategically, right? So they're really trying to just enhance the human gene pool to the point where just a point so far beyond what is evolutionarily possible, right? And so we're looking at things such as a much more robust spiritual receptivity in our bodies, We're looking at resistance to disease. We're looking at a whole bunch of different mindal advancements. It's just total upgrade, right?
Right. And how do they go about achieving this uplift, this genetic uplift?
Well, it's skillfully and strategically injecting their DNA into the human gene pool. So what they do basically is when they get here, they live in usually a garden area, which is most often referred to as the Garden of Eden. And what they do is they build up a race of people based on their genetics, right? And so they start procreating until they, on most worlds, get to a level of about 1 million people or so. And then they start going out and, well, on our planet, they were supposed to start going out and blending with the indigenous races on our planet, right? On most worlds, the people actually come to the Garden of Eden to do that. But things are, a little bit different here. So they had a bit of a different plan. So that's really how it gets upstepped. And on a normal world, when Adam and Eve arrive, one of the major occupations of everybody on Earth is, it's like a huge competition. It's like, I want to be worthy of being able to mate with one of Adam and Eve's progeny. This is one of the major occupations of the indigenous peoples of planets once Adam and Eve get there. And that's something that we can't even comprehend really on our planet because it just never happened. But it's really interesting to hear about how it happens on a normal world, right? So obviously this is something that requires management.
Right.
And that's one of the main reasons why it didn't happen here, is because Adam and Eve defaulted and they weren't able to be here long enough to manage something that was going to take thousands of years to play out, right? So, we do not have as much, what would you call it, divine genetics as we are supposed to on our planet, unfortunately.
Yeah. Very unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. I was just reading a part in the book that's not usually associated with Adam and Eve, and they were talking about the fact that because we don't have the normal complement of divine genetics, people on our planet have to fight a lot more between the, what would you call it, the evolutionary and spiritual natures, the dual natures. It's a lot more of a struggle here than it usually is on a normal evolving planet. Right. That's just something that we have to deal with now here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
do you want to explain real quick, like how they defaulted and what was the cause of that?
Sure. Yeah. So Adam and Eve, they came here, and as I mentioned, they're supposed to be a continuation of and build on what is been put in place by the planetary prince and his staff, right? So generally speaking, what's supposed to happen is that before they even get here, the planetary prince and his administration lays down this plan for what Adam and Eve are supposed to do on the planet. And Adam and Eve get here, and they're supposed to inaugurate, all this huge renaissance of culture and spirituality and science and you name it, right? They're also supposed to do things like replace monarchical government with the beginnings of representative government. That's the level that they usually come to a planet at, right? We're sort of just on that line right now ourselves in the past 100 or so, 100, 200 years, right? We've still got monarchical government, and we're slowly transitioning into different forms of representative government, right?
Yeah.
So I'm saying this because they were tasked with something that an Adam and Eve usually never have to deal with. So when they got here, the universe circuits, they were all quiet. They couldn't really communicate off planet except through certain archangels. They not only did they not have this foundation that they usually have to build on, but they had active resistance from the planetary prince who was still here. And so they had a really, really tough job ahead of them. They were relatively successful in their first 100 years or so. They started being able to build out of the garden and through trade relations and things like that, start trying to spread the culture and all of that kind of stuff. But it was a really, really slow process and very disheartening. They were very, very isolated, and they often talked to each other about how slow it was going and their frustrations. And the planetary prince, his name is Caligastia, he often visited the garden and tried to get Adam and Eve to go over to his side of things. And they always resisted. And he decided to try to do an end run on Eve rather than Adam. So over the course of several years, through a very able and enthusiastic lieutenant from the surrounding tribes, Confederation of Tribes, he sort of, I don't know exactly what the word is. Like he wasn't in the guy's mind or anything. The guy's name was Sarapatasha, tomato. But he was using this guy as an end run to get to Eve, to get her to either default or to go into open rebellion, right? And they decided that they were going to sort of take a shortcut. And they decided that they were going to get, because as I said before, what the plan was is they were supposed to build up like 1 million of their own pure line progeny before they started going out, right? And Adam and Eve themselves are never supposed to procreate with indigenous people on the planet. It's their children who go on and do this, right? So Eve basically, talking with Sarapatasha over the course of several years, decided that they were going to do a quick shortcut and have some offspring who would go and immediately upstep Sarapatasha's tribe so that they could, really get things going there, sort of like it's a shortcut, right?
But
and that's not the way things are supposed to happen. And once it happened, she sort of realized, oh my God, what have I done? But it contravened the way that it was supposed to happen, and it caused the default. So she basically had a child with not Seripatesia himself, but the spiritual leader of his tribe, and that guy's name was Cano, Cano, and their child was Cain. That's how Cain fits into the picture. So Cain was the child of Eve, but not of Adam. So that caused the default. So I guess it's also important to say, well, Eve defaulted. What about Adam? He didn't default. But Adam, because Adam and Eve, they're called material sons and daughters, they always work in pairs. And the prospect of him being completely alone without Eve on the planet, trying to do all of this stuff on his own, he just couldn't bear it. So he went out and he found a woman from the tribe, and he committed the same folly as Eve did. And he, I think her name was Leota, and their child was called Sansa. And so they both committed the same folly, which ended up in the default of both of them and their mission. So that's actually really what happened. It's a lot different than the biblical version. But in both versions, there is a default. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
A little different than, eating a forbidden apple, but same concept, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of see that in other stories too. And, it's something we're going to talk about in a little bit. You see all these other stories that are in our history that are kind of related to this, and you can kind of draw on where they actually originated from or got some of their roots and foundations in this story, which is very interesting. And I think it's just real quick, it's important to throw out real quick. This happened, according to the Urantia book, around 38,000 years ago.
Yep.
Is when Adam and Eve came.
Yep.
And they lived here before they defaulted. I think it was like 130-ish years, 130 something, somewhere around there. 120 something maybe.
Yep.
But it was around there before they defaulted, and then some other things happened. If you want to maybe go into that, they're leaving the garden and
so maybe it's kind of important to talk a little bit about the mechanics of the default.
Okay.
Because that's something that I was like, okay, well, they made a mistake. Why is that a default? Right?
Right.
And that was something a little hard for me to reconcile when I first read this account in the Urantia book. Like, I don't, like, how does that constitute a default? Like, why couldn't they just like ask for forgiveness and carry on? A lot of it has to do with the status of their immortality. So when these sons of God are bestowed on a planet, they are, for all intents and purposes, immortal. So the planetary prince, he's a spiritual being. We can't even see him, so he's immortal anyway. But his visible staff, which we haven't talked about, but I'm sure you've talked about in other podcasts, they were immortal, but they were physical beings that we could see. They had physical bodies based on our planetary genetics. They could be seen. Their bodies were modified in such a way that they could be immortal. And it required the fruit of a tree. And that is the tree of life from legend. And that's why the tree is so important. And it even finds its way into the biblical narrative, even though it's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But there actually was a tree, and it's a very important tree because the fruit of that tree was the thing that allowed the immortality to carry on for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. That's the sustenance that was required.
Right. And this tree also came from off-world. This was brought here for this purpose.
That's right. So it's not something that we'll be able to find, trudging through the Amazon or anything like that, a tree like that anymore. It was a very specific tree for a very specific purpose, brought here for that purpose. The mechanism of how that works, though, is as I said, their bodies were specifically modified so that they could take advantage of this fruit. And part of that mechanism within the body requires a constant connection to the universe and the universe mother spirit. And when you do something that is not in line with the universe and the plans of the universe, the divine plan, that connection gets severed. And immediately. And that is the mechanism of the default, because they went against the divine plan. That circuit, that connection got severed, and they lost their ability to take advantage of that fruit which gave them immortality. So why was it so important that they keep their immortality? Is because this biologic uplift of humanity and blending of the race of their people with the indigenous people of our planet required skillful and strategic blending and management. Right. And if they aren't here to actually do that, who is going to manage it? And that's the problem, and that's the mechanism of the default.
And on our world, we were just talking about this the other day. On our world, they were actually a normal world. Their progeny has to number around 1 million. And on our world, because of the rebellion and because we were drastically behind, they were given permission to only get to the number 500,000 before they went and
start going out. Yeah, it's interesting though that they had also in the original plan said, they had set plans to send 1 million of Adam and Eve's pure line children to North America as well, because North America was isolated and the indigenous Americans were here and they needed to be upstepped just the same as everybody else, right? So there was actually a plan to send 1 million over to North and South America, which never happened.
Right.
So I think that was
North
an
and
extra
South America end up getting some of this through, some other migrations and stuff. And I mean, we did get, some through, some of what happened, but we didn't get anywhere near what we were supposed to.
Not like the plan. Not like the plan at all, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's one of the two major devastating things that has happened to our planet in our long recorded history. The first was the betrayal of our planet to Lucifer's rebellion, and the second was the failure of Adam and Eve in their mission.
Yep.
So those are two pretty heavy blows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then Adam and Eve, they after they become mortal, and I think maybe just a couple fun facts just before we start going too far down the story, but
sure. Yeah.
Adam and
Okay.
Eve had telepathic ability, which is
With their immediate children, they did.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, which is always really, really interesting to me.
Yeah, there was something in their physiology that allowed them to do it. They call it gas chambers. Yeah. So we're talking about like some sort of different physiology as well within their progeny.
Right.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder. I recently just did a podcast with Halbert Katzen, and we were talking about genetic variation, the microcephalin gene that has been discovered, and it somehow came about around 37,000 years ago, and it has to do with brain and brain size and brain growth, and it's really interesting because he went on to talk about kind of how this research has kind of been kind of oppressed a little bit or just because it's controversial, because it has to do with race and certain things. And so, the people who are doing this research are really discouraged from doing it, and kind of, they kind of backed away from it. But the Chinese decided to take this into their own hands, and they actually genetically manipulated rhesus monkeys with this gene.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it led to brain growth, and
They
these
got
monkeys
smarter.
and
Intelligence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so that's really interesting,
Yeah.
and I think it makes me wonder, because the Urantia book doesn't say this specifically, but if Adam and Eve wouldn't have defaulted and the plan would have went how it's supposed to, like, what level of telepathy might we have available to us today through that? I mean, or any, if at all, I mean, just because they had that ability doesn't mean that would have been passed on through their genes to us.
That's true.
It's just kind of fun to speculate about, though. It could be possible. That might have been one of the things we lost.
Very, very possible, right? There's a part that I was reading yesterday that talked a little bit about that. All right. So this is paper 34, 34, section 7, paragraph 4. Says the Urantia peoples are suffering the consequences of a double deprivation of help in the task of progressive planetary spiritual attainment. The Caligastia upheaval precipitated worldwide confusion and robbed all subsequent generations of the moral assistance which a well-ordered society would have provided. But even more disastrous was the Adamic default, in that it deprived the races of that superior type of physical nature which would have been more consonant with spiritual aspirations. So, and then next paragraph, it says, Urantia mortals are compelled to undergo such marked struggling between the spirit and the flesh because their remote ancestors were not more fully atomized by the Edenic bestowal. It was the divine plan that the mortal races of Urantia should have had physical natures more naturally spirit responsive. So we take what you've just said, that it's hard to imagine what we would have been like had Adam and Eve succeeded. I think that's a really, really big clue.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because, physical natures, you often think of like stature or, you're built or whatever, but a physical nature could be just your brain or aspects of your brain, part of your brain size, brain capacity, or gas chambers in your brain that would allow you to do this. So.
And what does it mean to be have your physical natures be more naturally spirit responsive?
Right.
Like, yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be really nice to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and then after the default.
So yeah, so like I guess to carry on with the story, because there's some important parts in there. When the inhabitants of the garden, and there was quite a few inhabitants in the garden, it wasn't just Adam and Eve, obviously, and their kids. When they found out about what had happened especially between Eve and Suriptatia and Cano, they freaked. They totally freaked out, and they were absolutely incensed, and they went on the warpath, and they went out of the garden, and they completely destroyed that tribe. So yeah, a lot of imagery in there.
Yeah.
And word of that spread pretty quickly, because it wasn't just the one tribe that Suriptatia was head of. It was a whole confederation, right? So Cano was killed in that attack. Suriptatia just, saw everything crashing down around him, lost it, and drowned himself in the Great River. So he was gone too. So the remaining confederation of tribes, as news of this got to them, they started getting pretty upset. And they basically started amassing a huge army to march on the garden and take revenge. So Adam and Eve, they sat down and they talked about this, and they decided they weren't going to defend themselves against this, and they decided that instead they were going to leave the garden. And so they left the garden, and when this confederation of tribes arrived, they found the garden empty, unoccupied, and they settled in and took over. Adam and Eve themselves. So we should also mention that the general location of this first garden is described as a long, narrow peninsula, extending westwards from the eastern shores of the then Mediterranean Ocean. Okay. So the most well-received theory of where this actually is right now, and it's just a theory still, it hasn't been proved, but that theory basically places it off the coast of Syria right now. So they left the garden because they couldn't go west, because that was basically water, sort of. It was more inland lake than Mediterranean Ocean at the time. But they couldn't go there. They couldn't go north because that's where most of the army was coming from. South of them, it was very hostile as well, so they couldn't go there. So the only place they could really go was east. And they ended up going east into an area in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and set up camp there, and that became the second and more well-known location for the Garden of Eden. So there's actually two gardens. There's the first one, which is where that's the garden, and that's, the paradise, sort of the image that we have. And then there's the second garden, which became the cradle of Occidental and Dravidian civilization, right? So that's where they went, and they set up camp, and they started trying to rebuild, a version of the garden, and try and make good.
Yeah.
Basically, right? So
yeah, and so where's the part where Cain goes to the land of Nod to find his wife. Is that from the second garden?
Yeah. So it actually took them quite a long time to go from the first garden to this area where the second garden was being built. And I have a lot of trouble reconciling how long it took them to get there with how far it actually is away from the first garden area. It says it took them a year to actually get from the first garden to the Euphrates River, which if you go on there and measure it right now, it's only about 150 miles. So, yeah. Regardless, though, Cain was born before they, 9 months, right? And it took them a year to get to the Euphrates River. So he was sort of born on the way. Cain. In terms of Cain and Abel, Abel was the firstborn of Adam and Eve in the second garden. And he was actually born 2 years after they got there and started setting up shop. So Cain was a little bit older than Abel. And he was born on the way. And Sansa as well, Adam's daughter, she obviously was born on the way as well. So Sansa, the Bible doesn't really talk about her, but she apparently went off and married a big, huge chieftain who was part of the blue race. I think that would probably be up in the European area, probably. Yeah, so that's where she ended up.
And so how about the so you said that they lost their immortality.
Yeah.
But they still lived for a very long time.
Yes. Yeah. We're still talking superhumans, and they had certain physiology, divine physiology. Yeah. So I think Adam lived to just over 500 years old, and he outlived Eve by about 19 years. But their children were designed to not be immortal. And as the generations went on, they lost their longevity until it was pretty much equal with the indigenous races of the planet. So
yeah, and it's really interesting. In a lot of different mythology and stuff, you hear of in some of these stories of these people who lived incredibly long lives, and that again correlates to this story. And
it does, but it also correlates to the prince's staff as well, right? Who were incredibly long-lived. Like the prince's staff, when they first got here, was 500,000 years ago from now.
So, well, technically, when they first got here, they were immortal as well.
They were, yes. In exactly the same way that Adam and Eve were immortal, right? They had to use the fruit of this tree of life to stay immortal. We're talking about the visible planetary staff, who we remember as the Anunnaki, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were immortal until the rebellion.
Right.
At such time as they lost their immortality, except for one or two of them. So when you look at those records, the Sumerian records, remembering that far back, the Anunnaki, the prince's staff arrived 500,000 years ago, and the Lucifer rebellion was just over or around 200,000 years ago. So we're talking 300,000 years of time that they were here on the planet, being immortal. So when you look back at the Sumerian kings lists, you can see that some of those lifetimes are incredibly long, and that's one of the reasons why. There's other
Well, it's not
reasons
even
too.
necessarily their lifetimes; it's their reign of being king. It doesn't really
Right.
necessarily say that
Yeah.
that's how long they lived. That's how long they were just king, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So there's other reasons though for that in the king's list, right? I think one of the other reasons is how they measured time.
right.
I think some of the time with the reigns on that list are measured in months rather than years. That kind of thing also happened. But we are talking about a tradition of a planetary staff that lived on this planet for 300,000 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the same mechanism that Adam and Eve were using as well, until
Right.
they lost their ability to make use of it.
And so, do you think that part of what may have taken them so long to get from the first garden to where they set up for the second garden was because of transporting the tree of life?
They weren't allowed to take it.
Oh, they weren't. Oh, okay.
They weren't allowed to take it. So apparently what happened was when the Confederation of Tribes came down and took over the garden, they were absolutely ecstatic because they found the tree. And the tradition is that if you eat the fruit of this tree, you're going to live forever. But they they didn't have the mechanism in their bodies for it to work, right? So,
right.
They're eating the fruit and they're going, well, how come this isn't doing anything to me? And they eventually got really upset and they torched the whole place, destroyed the temple that the tree was in, and they burnt the tree.
Now I remember that, yeah.
And there was nobody left on Earth that the tree could have benefited at that point anyway. Not saying that in the future it couldn't benefit somebody who comes that might need it, but it's
Right.
gone now. Yeah. So, and that's the other really important thing I think about the Adam and Eve story is that from the time that the prince came 500,000 years ago, all the way up until when Adam and Eve, well, I guess to the point where they died, which is, about, let's say 37,000 years ago, there was an unbroken connection, physical connection between the divine administration and the people on our planet. There was always a visible and physical manifestation of the divine administration here. So at the beginning, it was the Anunnaki. Then after that, it was Van, who was one of the loyal Anunnaki who sort of kept things going until Adam and Eve got here. Then it was Adam and Eve, and then that was it. After they died, that whole connection was severed, and and that's one of the reasons why it fell apart so quickly after Adam and Eve, because that connection was broken. There's no more physical manifestation of the divine administration on our planet like there is on every other planet.
Right.
So that's a huge problem. And
Yeah.
we've been dealing with that problem ever since Adam and Eve died. We're trying to. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not the way it is on other planets, on a normal
No.
planet. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
normal at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what it would be like on a normal planet because we're so far removed from that. I mean, a normal planet, the planetary prince doesn't rebel, and you have, civilization basically hundreds of thousands of years earlier than we did. That alone, you can imagine how, 500,000 years ago in Dalmatia, or maybe 400,000 years ago, it's not really specific on what happened exactly when, but they were working with steam power,
Yeah. I kind of imagine that was probably just before the outbreak of the rebellion. They had gotten to that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just amazing to think about. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, even if it was right before the rebellion, you're still talking, you know,
200,000
to 300,000
years.
years ago.
Where
you
would
know?
we be now? And just imagine, even in sense of continuity, right? Of human civilization and culture, if we could look back 500,000 years and see this continuity of culture and cooperation with divinity and building that culture, and just, I mean, you can hardly imagine it.
Right.
Right.
And then the whole Adam and Eve and the genetic uplift and
Yeah,
maybe
as a
we would all be
secondary.
speaking telepathically right now.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and then have this amazing advanced civilization. And on a normal world at this point, you would have celestial beings here who are ministering to the world. You wouldn't be quarantined like we are.
Yep.
You would have this amazing you know, situation. And you know, I remember there's a line somewhere in the Urantia book, I can't remember exactly where, but it talks about how some of these more advanced worlds are actually a little bit envious of us because you know, through these struggles that we go through, we have an ability for more of a pure childlike faith, whereas you know, because I mean, it's amazing to think like how screwed up our world is and all the horrible things that go on in our world that shouldn't happen. And there's a lot of us who still have faith in the goodness of God and the universe and everything. And so that's shows you how powerful that is.
Faith without knowing for sure and being able to see.
Right.
Faith without all of that is something valued by the universe. Yeah. There's a really, really good book written by Richard Omura, who is a very well-known Urantian. And it's called The Seven Circles, I think it's called. And it's a really amazing, I just love the premise of the book, right? It's this guy who's like, he's this corporate guy, I think it is, and he's like, you know, eat or be eaten kind of corporate culture, and he's just really not that good of a person and all of that. And somehow, I can't remember because it was a few years ago that I read it, but he finds himself 50,000 years in the future on our planet, right? And our planet has evolved to the point of light and life, which is very basically our idea of paradise on Earth, right? And so, you know, there's no war. We've you know, dealt with all of that and everything. And all of the people that he meets 50,000 years in the future are absolutely fascinated with this guy, right? And they're so jealous of him because he lived in a time where there was, what's the best way to describe this? There was so much fertile soil for spiritual development that we have right now because it's so messed up. And the choices that we make, and all of that kind of stuff, compared to, you know, living in a much more perfected society where they don't have those kinds of challenges to have to deal with anymore, right?
Right.
And they are actually jealous of this guy. Because he has, and again, that's the way I sort of envision it. It's fertile soil for spiritual development. It's based on this idea, this Buddhist idea, right? That the lotus is one of the most beautiful flowers on earth, right? But it actually is has to grow up through all of these layers of just absolute gross, total filthy muck in order to flower. And that's a very Buddhist sort of way of thinking, that, you know, up through all of this muck and just disgusting stuff, the most beautiful flower can actually bloom, right?
Right.
And that's the idea of the lotus. And I think that's where a lot of this idea comes from, that Richard was talking, trying to share in this book.
Right. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the I don't know if you've ever read the poem by Tupac Shakur, "The Rose That Grew from Concrete." It's pretty interesting. It's along the same line. It's even beauty can grow in between the cracks of.
That's right. Yeah.
Of the concrete jungle. You know.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, we're talking about all of these defaults and being betrayed to a insidious rebellion and how messed up things are on the planet. But there's a lot of opportunity for us to grow here, which I think we will eventually look back on once we're, you know, more advanced spiritual beings, and we'll look back on this and we'll go, wow, there were a lot of opportunities there that maybe we didn't realize or take advantage of. Of course, we don't know what we're doing here either, right? So
right. Yeah.
We have no idea. So hindsight is always, you know, 20/20. But I like to think about those things because I think it's something that we will very, very clearly see as we move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so with moving forward, we had kind of talked about like different mythologies that kind of relate to the Urantia book and that have come along throughout history. And you found one that was really, really interesting, and I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah, well, it's something that's been bouncing around in my head since when I first found the Urantia book. I reached out to a few people initially at the time, and one of them was a guy named Mark Kulicki. I'm really hoping I'm saying his name right. I've only ever seen it written and I've not heard it pronounced, but I got in touch with him quite early on, and we emailed back and forth quite a bit, and he turned me on to this idea that as messed up as the account that survives of Adam and Eve that we have in the Bible is, because it really doesn't reflect anything that happened at all. I mean, the only thing that it really still reflects is there actually was a default. They had to leave the garden, and there was a tree that they eat fruit from.
And the voice in the garden. The voice in the garden.
The voice in the garden is something that I'd like to come back to, because that actually blows me away quite a bit. Let's just say it now. The thing about the Urantia book is that each of the papers were written by a different universe personality, right? And a lot, especially the historical stuff, and I'm thinking a lot of what I'm thinking here is part 4 when we're talking about the life and teachings of Jesus. They were written by people who were actually there and saw it all firsthand.
Right. Firsthand account. So it's almost like witness testimony.
Eyewitness testimony, right?
Yeah.
So the papers that talk about Adam and Eve, and this is the thing that blows me away, is the Bible remembers the voice in the garden. But, whenever there's something like that, or, when there's some sort of spiritual intervention, like I think there's when James, the brother of Jesus, was killed, Peter was imprisoned, and he was let out by, the angel of the Lord and things like that. That always gets attributed directly to God when it's actually like not exactly God. It's like an angel or a midwayer or something like that, right?
Right.
But this voice in the garden was actually an angel, and the angel's name was Salonia, is Salonia. And Salonia wrote the Adam and Eve papers. The voice in the garden wrote the papers about Adam and Eve that we have and can read in the Urantia book.
Yeah.
That is absolutely extraordinary to me. That just every time I even think about it, I'm like, who else could give you a better recounting of what happened other than Adam and Eve themselves?
Yeah. Well, and same with the Jesus papers, the midwayers that were all there at the time, and the recounting of Melchizedek, written by some of the Melchizedeks. Yeah, I mean, it's just doesn't really get better than eyewitness testimony, right?
You just, and that's the thing, when you look at the individuals or personalities who are writing these papers, you can't get any better than the people who are writing these papers. They know exactly what they're talking about.
Right.
On such an incredible level.
Personal level.
Exactly. Yeah. So every time I finish an Adam and Eve paper and see written by Salonia, the voice in the garden, I just go, whoa, that is, it just blows me away. It's just so amazing. Yeah. And the continuity of that, right? It's like you think, well, there was a voice in the garden. It was an angel, but there's no recognition there, right?
Right.
And now we know that voice was Salonia. Salonia's still around.
Yeah. And I gotta say, the Adam and Eve papers I haven't read them in a while. I'm a little rusty on them, but it was one of the early stories that I read, besides because I was really interested in the science type of stuff, and that paper 57, paper 15, those are two big ones. But when I started getting into some of the other stories, Pato Bonton and Antoinette suggested I read Adam and Eve, and that was one of the first papers that or first series of papers that I really remember profoundly impacted me spiritually, right? And good stuff.
It really is. Yeah. So getting back to the mythology and stuff, right? So we've got a very, very what's the word? It's fragmented and not very well remembered account of Adam and Eve in the Bible. And what's interesting to me, and what Mark shared with me, was that we actually do have a much better remembrance of Adam and Eve in a different mythology or legend, and that's the Arthurian legend. It's King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Camelot and all of that, right? And so if you sort of sit back and think about that for a little while, I won't get into the, the whole thing and everything, but I'll give you enough for you to just, be able to sit back and let it percolate in your mind a bit, right? Because I think it deserves some specific thought on everybody's part as to how well the actual events of the Adamic default fit into the Arthurian legend. And it might kind of blow you away a bit, but I mean, so let's just think, first of all, the Garden of Eden, right? And let's compare that to how Camelot is described. basically we're talking, both of these things are intended to be the heart of an advanced civilization or a new civilization. It's structured, it's purposeful and enlightened. And harmony is the norm here, right? And that parallel between Camelot and Eden, I think, is striking in of itself, right? It's just, and we're just getting started here,
Okay.
So, and you think, okay, Eden, Camelot, Knights of the Round Table. Adam actually did collect himself. Well, he actually organized the Garden of Eden into divisions, and he had captains and lieutenants of each division and stuff like that, and they would all meet. I don't know if it was a round table or not. That, we don't want to get too pedantic, but that's kind of what was going on with Arthur and Camelot, and having this round table of everybody contributing, right? And I think that's a much looser parallel, but it's basically we're talking about principal supporters of this new idealized society, right? And I think they both fit that really, really well. So when you're talking about, okay, well, how does it fit with the actual individuals within these legends? I think you can make a direct link between Adam and Arthur. That's kind of a no-brainer to me. Guinevere is not Eden. Guinevere is Eve. Adam and Eve, Arthur and Guinevere, right? And then you have in the Arthurian legend, you have Eve running off with Sir Lancelot and having an affair.
So and Lancelot would be...
well, see, in the actual account of Adam and Eve, there's sort of a dual sort of thing going on there. It's Seripatesia and Eve were talking about it all the time, but the actual affair was with somebody else, whereas in the Arthurian legend, it was just the one person, right? Lancelot. But, I mean, it's not exact, but, I mean, it's still, compared to the account in the Bible, we're still tracking this remarkably exactly, okay, in my opinion. The child of the transgression is Mordred in the Arthurian legend.
So it'd be Cain?
Well, no, Mordred in the Arthurian legend is Adam's son, Arthur's son. But, in terms of comparing them, Cain and Mordred are kind of the parallel, I think, and I think that's a pretty evident sort of comparison.
Okay.
I think Caligastia and Morgan Le Fay are really, really good parallels right there. The external betrayer or the undermining adversary who's trying to destabilize the whole thing. That's Caligastia. That's Morgan Le Fay.
Okay.
You've got, in the Arthurian legend, you've got Merlin.
I was just going to say, okay, who's Merlin?
Right?
Is that going to be Van?
Van. It's totally Van. Like, how can it not be Van?
I don't know. That just seemed like it was going to be Van. Yeah.
I know, right? Like, how could it not be? Like, both of them prepare the way for the king or the ruler, right?
Right.
And
okay.
they're guiding the emergence of this new age. And that's I mean, yeah. I mean, it's, you can start seeing how this is so parallel, right? And
I was starting to see it a little bit.
Yeah. And then, there's the whole story of, once Camelot falls, there's this whole period of Arthur goes into this funk, I guess you could say, and Galahad goes in search. Well, he goes in search for the Holy Grail or whatever, but he's looking for this. He's looking for this revival of the original idea in some way to save this, right?
Okay.
And I think the counterpart to and this is Galahad in the Arthurian legend, right? Who goes out and does this, Sir Galahad? I think the counterpart to that would be Seth. And in Adam and Eve, Seth is one of Adam and Eve's children. Early on in the second garden, he's the one who took over the religious aspect of it all. And part of that was because Adam and Eve were really, really preoccupied with building up the whole new garden and everything. They had to build a wall for defense. They had to, construct the buildings. They had to, 1,000 different things pulling at them from every direction.
Right.
It was the spirituality that sort of took a second seat, at least at the beginning, right? So their son Seth stepped in to take over all of that. And so he was the one who kept all of that going in the second garden. And he was the originator of what's remembered as the Sethite priesthood. So there's two versions of that. The one that we most remember is sort of the second version of the original Sethite priesthood. The original Sethite priesthood would be obviously a lot more in line with the actual divine reality as opposed to the second version of it. But so you got all, it's just.
So, okay, wait.
Yeah.
Is Excalibur supposed to be like a metaphor for the Tree of Life? I mean,
Well,
it gets
I never
left
thought
behind
about that.
and only the king or the one who is, divinely chosen or whatever in the Arthurian legend. I guess it's not divinely chosen, but the one who is chosen is the only one who could pull the sword from the stone, right? And that's kind of like only the divine beings who have that ability to I mean, it seems like there's a parallel
I
there.
think you could make a really good argument there. I never really thought about that bit, but I think you could make a good argument.
Yeah.
So basically, I've given all these parallels, and I'm going to leave that as food for thought for everyone. But I just feel like with this many direct parallels in all of the individuals and events, and you've got your Camelot, you've got your Eden, you've got Adam and Eve, and you've got Arthur and Guinevere, and then the Lancelot and the affair. I mean, that is actually what happened.
Yeah. It's definitely a lot. Yeah.
And I'm forced to wonder if this wasn't somehow deliberately placed in our legends and lore to help us kind of remember what actually happened. Because the Arthurian legend has evolved over time, right? And where it is now, the way I'm describing it, is basically the story of Adam and Eve.
Right.
And it wasn't always that, right? But now,
so where does the Arthurian legend story, where does that come from? Like, do you know where and when that originated?
Well, historically, we're talking about England after the decline of Rome, right?
Right.
So
it doesn't seem like long enough ago, but yeah, it seems.
Yes, but I'm talking about manipulation on a celestial level of a legend in order to help us remember something more important.
Right. Because there's no basis of any of the Arthurian legend, is there? Like
that's hard to say. Really? My thing with legend and myth is that there's usually a pretty strong kernel of truth in most of it, right? Right. And I think the biggest example of that is the guy who found Troy. And I'm not going to remember his name, or maybe I am. I'm not going to remember his name. Schliemann, I think. Heinrich Schliemann or something like that. Anyway, so he's this guy. He's this, I don't know if he's amateur or he's a total archaeologist, but this is back when they first started doing real archaeology in the late 1800s, I think. Yes. Might have been earlier. Everyone's saying, oh, that's just a myth. It never really happened. And he's like, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually read the legend. And I'm going to go to where it says Troy was, and then I'm going to start digging. Now, I'm being superficial because there was another guy involved who actually got him to go to a different place to dig, and that was the actual place that Troy was found. But basically, what I'm trying to say is he actually took the legend at face value, went and started digging and found it. And I think that's an excellent example of the fact that there is this core kernel of truth to a lot of our legends and stuff like that. If you look at all of the Greek mythology, the Egyptian mythology, you've got this pantheon of gods, right? There's a direct correlation of all of these gods to the original prince's staff, the Anunnaki, the Sumerian pantheon of gods, which are the remembered staff members of the prince's staff. Each of these, there was departments where they
I guess what in terms of the legend of Arthur and Camelot.
Yep.
Like,
sorry, I went off track there.
Besides Adam and Eve, is there any correlation to like Camelot being like an actual real place?
Well, there's Gary could tell you a little bit more about this. Gary Tom, he's been there, but there's the castle of, I'm going to say this wrong, but it's Tintagel, which is the traditional seat of where Arthur actually lived, I believe, or where he was born. There's ruins of a castle there and stuff like that. So there's a lot of locations that are associated with the legend in England and Wales. I don't know what to say about that.
I don't know what I'm trying to ask. I guess I'm just trying to understand better of where the legend of King Arthur comes from.
Well, that's where it comes from. It's basically from, Arthur is described or most commonly associated with, like, the time period would be just after the fall of Rome, sort of at the beginning of the Dark Ages. That's basically when all of this was supposed to have happened. So, and they, everyone says, well, he wasn't a real person and all of that kind of stuff. And it's based on a whole bunch of different people all sort of globbed into one individual and all of this kind of stuff. But again, I point to the guy who found Troy, and he just read the thing at face value. I'm not saying everything's like that, but I'm saying that I think we should, give a little bit more credit to the core kernel of some of these myths and legends that come down to us through the centuries and millennia. So that's sort of where I stand with that. But it really does, like, ever since Mark told me about that, I've had that sort of percolating in my brain, and I can't stop I can't stop thinking about it because the parallels are so striking. Yeah, they're so
I'm probably gonna get off
striking.
of here and go do a bunch of research.
Right. Right? Yeah.
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 I need to know more about the Arthurian legend because I don't know a whole
Exactly.
lot about it. So
Yeah.
I want to kind of dive into that. So
Yeah.
well, that was really fun, unexpected twist. I knew you had something up your sleeve for me, but yeah,
Yeah.
that was good.
Yeah. It's good.
Yeah, really good. So is there anything else you want to add to this that story or to the Adam and Eve story?
There are a few things, sort of outstanding things with Adam and Eve, right? So some of the things I'm particularly interested in is the question, and we didn't really talk about this, but just to bring everybody up to speed, about 3 or 4 days into their exodus from the first garden, I'm not sure the best way to say this, but the seraphic transports arrived, and Adam and Eve found out exactly what the repercussions of their default was going to be. And part of those repercussions was that, well, it was basically what was going to happen with all their kids. And they had quite a few kids already. I can't remember the number, but it was well over 1,000. And what was decided, not by them, but what was decided was that all of the children under the age of choice, which I think was about 20, were to be removed. And all of the kids of choice and above were allowed to choose for themselves as to whether they would want to stay here on Earth with Adam and Eve, or they wanted to go with the rest of the kids. And so there are a lot of Adam and Eve's first, second, third, I think maybe even fourth generation progeny who are sitting there on the constellation capital, and nobody knows what's going to happen. Like, why are they there? What's the plan? And that's something that bounces around in my head a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the purpose? What are they? Why are they still there? Are they being held in reserve for something? Is there some sort of scenario where they would maybe come back? Yeah. So, there's a lot of questions there, and that's something that is left a little bit open-ended, I'm sure for a lot of very good reasons. But that's something in my mind that bounces around quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that preoccupies my mind about them a lot, largely because of my own project, which is a TV show that is going to have to somehow depict what they look like. So I'm quite preoccupied with what they actually look like. And there's a description of them, obviously, but it's not as detailed as you would actually like. So it describes their skin as having a violet hue, and it glowed with a divine brilliance, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, at nighttime, they would sort of, bundle up a little bit if it got cooler or whatever. And so the only parts of them that you could really see of their skin would be their heads, right? And it glowed. And we're told that that's where the tradition of halos come from, because you would have this sort of glow around their heads and stuff like that. So
yeah.
the idea that, spiritual people or spiritual people, let's just say that, are always depicted with halos, comes from the absolute total depths of our history. We're talking 30, 35, 36,000 years ago these traditions come from, right? And it's because of how Adam and Eve looked. So we have that. I don't know how to show skin of a violet hue that glows, but I'm working on it. We're told they were 8 feet tall. We're also told that they had blue eyes. We aren't told what color hair they had, or even if they had hair. But we're told that all of their descendants, the genetics that they injected into the human gene pool, it's those genetics that give us the lighter color of hair. So the indigenous populations were all dark eyes and really dark to black hair across the board. It's the Adamic genetics that give our populations the lighter colors of hair. So we know that. But did Adam and Eve themselves have hair? Doesn't say. It doesn't say what color their hair was or anything like that. There's another thing, because we're talking about divine genetics, right? So it doesn't really say too much about what they physically look like beyond that. And I've noticed, because I watch a lot of historical stuff and things like that, and my ears always sort of prick up when I hear about things where I know there was specific activity in terms of his Adam and Eve's descendants. So one of these places is Peru. We know that 120 pure line descendants of Adam and Eve made it to Peru, going across all of the island.
132? 132?
Oh, sorry, 132. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And, we've seen some kind of weird things coming out of Peru. We've seen these mummies with elongated skulls. And these skulls aren't particularly human in that the way that the skull is fused together, I forget what they're called, fissures or something like that. But human skulls basically have pretty much the same. The skulls are sort of fused together. The plate bits are fused together in the same way. These elongated skulls are not like that at all. So there's something extra or non-human about these skulls. And they're really elongated, right? And if the people who are watching, if you've not seen this, check them out. They're called the Paracas skulls. So, you hear this, and then you sort of look at other indigenous cultures and stuff like that. You hear about this practice of them binding the skulls of their children. And it's to give the skulls this elongated shape, right? And you think to yourself, well, why would all of these cultures want to be doing that? What are they trying to emulate?
Right. Well, you see it in stone carvings too. You see stone carvings with people with elongated skulls, really, it's really interesting that is in so many different places, and I mean it's all over the place, and different times, different eras.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So I think there is mention of, I'm not sure if it's Adamite or if it's more blended andite skulls being more narrow than broad. That's the only thing that I've seen mention of in terms of skull types and stuff like that. But I think it's really compelling and intriguing to sort of think about these things, because it's a widespread practice over a lot of indigenous cultures. And we're not just talking about South America, we're talking about Africa, we're talking about, are we talking about India? I can't remember, but we're talking really widespread. What are they trying to emulate? Now, if we were on a different show, like Ancient Aliens or something like that, we'd be saying it's all alien. But
Right.
but it's I think there's a better explanation. I think it's very, very possible. I'm not saying it is. It is definitely this, but I think the greater probability of reality is that they might be Adam and Eve's genetics we're talking about. Yeah.
Well, if you think about Adam and Eve and the microcephalin gene we're talking about, which means bigger brain size, right?
Bigger brain.
If you have bigger brain, right, you need a bigger skull. Well, I mean, it doesn't mean you need a wider skull. It could be just longer, right?
Yeah.
And then they also have these extra gas chambers that allowed them to telepathically communicate.
So how does that fit into this?
Room for that, right? Yeah.
Right.
So there's two things right there, which you would need. They would have to have bigger.
And
skulls.
then when
now,
you're
being
blending,
8
right?
feet tall, they might have just had bigger heads, but it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch for me to see what you're trying to say here.
Yeah.
That they might have had elongated skulls. That should have very well been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when you're blending with earlier versions of humanity, who had obviously smaller, at least cranial capacities, what we have now would kind of be the midpoint between the two, in my mind, right? Because you're blending, you're upstepping, you're blending. So what we would expect is Adam and Eve's progeny to have bigger brains than us, in order to get the smaller brains of our ancestors to the size that we've got now, because we would be mid. I'm just logically spitballing here, though, but that to me is a very logical. It's a logical argument, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sitting here, because of this project I've taken on, trying to figure out how am I going to portray these two remarkable individuals and their children in a way that does them justice. And I'm struggling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've seen some of the stuff that you came up with, and I tried to do some of my own using AI, and AI just isn't gonna.
Can't do it.
No, can't do it.
There's nothing for it to base those ideas on. I've got some ideas. I got some ideas of who to ask and things like that. So not willing to share that publicly at this point, though. But I've got some ideas. So hopefully what I've got there right now was sort of placeholder, and I'm not happy with it, but it's placeholder. So hopefully by the time we have to show Adam and Eve in the series, we'll have figured it all out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of your series, I think this is a good time to let's dive into that and talk about your series and what is it? What is it about? If you're talking to somebody who's never even heard of it, tell them what it is.
I feel like I've just finished eating hot wings.
Okay.
This camera. Tell them what's going on. Yeah.
You heard it here first.
That's awesome.
And if you don't get this right, you lose $1 million.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No pressure. No.
So
yeah, just no. Your project's awesome. I am
you're part of it, man.
Blessed.
So yeah.
I was just gonna say I'm very blessed and thankful to be a part of it and to have contributed to the pilot episode, and now we're on season 1. So yeah, I think it's a really great project, and why don't you just tell us a little bit about it and what What made you decide to actually take on something of this magnitude?
Yeah, like, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of big, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of little things that contribute to me actually getting to the point where I would take something like this on. But I think fundamentally is the question that hangs over a lot of people's heads in the Urantia community is, how do you share such an immense book, we're talking 2,100 pages, with a society that is increasingly not getting their information by reading, right? It's like, I don't like reading, and you're like, well, here's this awesome book, you should read it.
Yeah.
Right?
No thanks.
Like we've got to come up with other ways to get the vision that is in that book into the minds of people. And so you have to look at different kinds of media in order to do that. And I think the most compelling format right now is video.
Yeah.
There's other stuff that's coming that excite me a lot, like virtual reality. But right now, most people have access to video where not so many people have access to virtual reality, right? I think video is the best way to get this vision, such a massive vision of reality into the minds of people. And that's where it needs to be. It needs to be in their minds so that they can see it, so they can sit back and really, really just try and wrap their heads around it and just see how everything just works together. It's like a massive tapestry, right? It's like every little thread in its place properly contributes to such a massive whole, right?
Yeah.
Whole tapestry. And that's what it is. Everything in its proper place, just doing its thing. And you step back and you look at it and you understand and you go, that is absolutely amazing. Of course, that's how it is.
Yeah.
Right? And so what we're going to try and do is actually show this to people. We're going to, the book is always, I see the Urantia book as a manual. It's a manual for living in the finite reality that we find ourselves living in right now, right? So there's a point, right? Like you can study the manual and study the manual and study the manual. It's great. But at some point you got to set it down, right? And do the stuff that's in it. And that's part of what we're going to do in this series. We're going to devote a whole season to that. But what we're going to try and do is we're just going to set the book aside for a moment. It's always there as a reference. And we're just going to, like I said, show people and tell people what's in it. So the format of this is it's a docuseries. And we're going to invite longtime readers of the Urantia books, people who have been studying it for decades, to sit down and just tell people what's in it. That's it. That's all it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot more structured and organized than that.
Well, it has to be structured. And so that's why there's a structure of seasons and episodes within the seasons. It's a total of 5 seasons. And each season is very specifically themed and designed to build this vision that the book gives us, right? And hopefully by the end of it, everyone will be able to see this vision, at least in very broad strokes. And then to fill in the little bits and the details, you can either go to somebody who's read the book, or you can start reading the book yourself for answers, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's the idea. The most important part, at least in my mind, is to get that vision of reality into the minds of people so that they can start thinking about it and pondering it. And
yeah.
So that's sort of what this is about. And we're going to be doing this in a visually compelling way. We're going to be doing lots of really inspirational graphics and depictions of everything, which is, I was talking before about trying to portray Adam and Eve. So, that's part of it. We're going to try and make it as epic as possible. And that's the plan. So 5 seasons, 4 seasons to basically share the vision of the book. And the 5th season is specially designed as so you got the vision. We know what's in the book. We know what we're supposed to be doing. We understand our place in the great scheme of things. We know the goals that are laid out in front of us. What do we do?
Yeah.
And that's what the 5th season is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is how do we do this? What do we do? How do we move forward? So that's what the 5th season is. And it's called Urantia TLDR. So what is TLDR? TLDR is too long didn't read. And I think that encapsulates the whole idea that people just don't want to get their information by reading so much anymore. They want to get it other ways. So too long didn't read, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And you had brought up Ancient Aliens a little bit earlier, and I kind of like a docuseries in terms of like how the pilot was structured and everything. Like, I used to be a really big fan of Ancient Aliens a long time ago. I've watched it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
But that's kind of what it reminded me of something similar to that, but just about the Urantia book. And so I thought that was awesome.
I like to describe it as Ancient Aliens, but true.
Yeah. the real version of Ancient Aliens.
Yeah.
Well, it's like on the last podcast I did with Gary Tong, I was like, this is the best episode of Ancient Aliens ever made.
Exactly. Yeah, cool. Awesome, right? Yeah.
Because we were talking about, basically Ancient Aliens, but it was, just true.
And that is something that I find quite compelling as well, especially with the history, is you have, especially people like Graham Hancock, who are discovering all these remnants of a civilization. It's a singular civilization, and he's actually come to that conclusion himself. That is spread out all over the world, and we have the answer to what that civilization is. We're just coming at it top down, where he's coming looking at it from bottom up, and it would be really interesting to have, to show him all of this information and have him comment on it. But I don't know. Yeah. You never know, right? Yeah.
Never know. You never know.
Yeah.
So if people are really interested in learning more about Urantia TLDR, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, the best place most central place would be the website, which is urantiatldr, all one word, .com. So that's a good stepping off place. Urantia TLDR is being exclusively distributed by Channel 606, which is a collective of Urantian creators, content creators. You and I are both part of that. It, among many other things, gives us a central distribution platform for all of the stuff that we're doing. So I'm sure people will be hearing a lot more of that as time goes on this year, even as we build it out. But yeah, you'll be able to find it on.
Information about Channel 606 coming soon.
That's right. Yeah. So it's coming soon, but that's where TLDR will be.
Yeah.
It's on. Well, the pilot is already available on Channel 606, so you can get to that from the website. Yeah. So right now we're just busy in pre-production on season 1, which is going to be 7 episodes.
Yeah.
So we got a lot of work in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been fun getting together and talking about some of those in the writing meetings and some of the stuff that you have come up with Paula. I think it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
Very, very awesome season.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm excited. Yeah.
Cool. Well, anything else that you would like to say before we get out of here?
I think, as soon as we're talking about Adam and Eve, I think a good place to maybe land would be to just remind everybody that Adam and Eve are still very, very much involved in the running of our divine administration here on the planet. It's not like they're gone. They're just serving in a much different capacity from which they were supposed to. All right. So there is a council of 24 elders from our planet who, there's what's the best way to describe it? It's people of high distinction from the whole history of our planet, right back almost like a million years. I think the oldest member is about 800,000 years old. I can never say his name. Ono Monolantan. Yeah, but anyway, it's like 24 distinguished people from our planetary history are on this. John the Baptist is on there. Melchizedek is on there.
Yep.
Adam and Eve. There's a few other people as well, which we don't need to get into. But they're very much involved in what's going on the planet. They're still working tirelessly to improve civilization, to guide us towards light and life. I think it's important to acknowledge that they're still here, even though we can't see them, and they're working in a different capacity. And they're still, I don't know if we can still call them our planetary parents, but I like to think of them that way. So I think it's important to remember that they're still here. Yeah.
And they're close enough to probably be able to hear our gratitude. So
you never know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. It's been awesome talking to you, Derek, and thanks for coming on here and doing this episode with me. This is
absolutely my pleasure.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. It's going to be an interesting one. Very, very, very good stuff. I like it.
Absolute pleasure.
Well, love you, man, and
love you too.
We'll talk again soon. All right.
Okay.
All right.
That would be awesome. Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye. See you, everybody.